Okay. Um, is everyone ready to like begin with the round then? Yeah. Okay. Before I begin, just a quick introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Bhavya Mehta. I'm going to be the first government speaker on the resolution that this House regrets the removal of the influence operation. For POIs, I'm not looking at the Zoom screen, so if you have any POIs, then feel free to yell it out. If I don't hear you the first time, then just keep saying it until I eventually respond. Okay, with that, my time for a 7-minute speech will begin in 3, 2, 1, and we strongly affirm the resolution that this House regrets the removal of the influence operation. First, for some round framing. This is going to be a value round because the word regrets, and we're going to be defining this House as the people of the foreign countries where the U.S. has spread these influence operations. Our value criterion is going to be net benefits through the lenses of the whole world, meaning whichever side proves that the influence operations provided the greatest good for the greatest amount of people through the lenses of the whole world should be the side that is winning this round. Okay, we're going to be moving on to our first and only, first we're going to move on to some definitions. We're going to define influence operations as organized attempts to inform a target audience about a specific topic, specifically on social media. Moving on to our first advantage, which is going to be on how influence, just one giant advantage on influence operations being good. Subpoint A is going to be human rights abuses. So just for some background, these influence operations ran for almost 5 years on 8 social networks and messaging apps promoting the views, values, and goals of the United States and attacked the interests of Russia, China, Iran, and other countries. Why is this important? Because many of these other countries have been historically known, or like just now in the present in the news, have been seen to be conducting human rights abuses. Let's talk about one specific example, which is going to be Russia and Ukraine. The most active campaign targeted Russian-speaking internet users in Central Asia, with much of the activity focused on criticizing Russia over civilian deaths and other atrocities following its invasion of Ukraine. In addition, so what this did is it targeted the Russia-Ukraine war and criticized Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Russia-Ukraine war is a huge issue in the status quo that is still occurring. Children are dying, people don't have money, people are getting unemployed. Essentially, it's just one whole huge bad thing that's causing a lot of death in Ukraine, right? And what the influence operation did is it worked to inform people in these areas about the issue, so it raised awareness. Another thing, another subpoint of this is going to be Russian imperialism in Syria. Just for some background, in 2015 there was a Russian military intervention in Syria, which was a pivotal moment for Moscow's Middle East policy. What this meant is when Russia intervened to like play the savior in Syrian politics, they're spreading their imperialistic operations because they're spreading their influence to the Middle East. U.S. influence operations targeted the clear imperialistic operations of Russia in Syria. Why is imperialism bad exactly? Imperialism has impacted many societies in countless negative ways in the past as well. It's led to
POI.
things like I won't take it right now because I have a lot to get through. It has led to things like the slave trade, then to social discrimination around the world. It's damaged cultures and created disunity among natives. In addition, it's also stripped countries of their natural resources and left nothing for the natives. Do we really want to let an actor like Russia, who has been shown to hurt its people and conduct a massive, harmful war against Ukraine, further its imperialist actions again in Syria, where disinformation is already being spread? No, we don't want to. This is what the influence operations aim to do. They aim to raise awareness and educate the people in those specific areas about the damages and the cons of this actually occurring. The third example we're going to bring up is China. The Central Asia campaign, which was one of the influence operations, consisted of 12 Twitter accounts, 25 Facebook profile pages, and 10 Instagram accounts, also spreading negative messaging about China's treatments of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, sorry if I mispronounce anything, where human rights activists say more than 1 million ethnic minority Muslims have been detained without trial. These accounts mainly focus on the genocide of Uyghurs and the Muslim minorities in re-education camps in the city. And what this did is it educated people in those areas and people around the world about the human rights abuses that China was creating. Posts described alleged organ trafficking, forced labor, sexual crimes against Muslim women, and suspicious disappearance of ethnic Muslims in the city. The assets also posted about the Chinese Communist Party's poor treatment of women in the country and often framed these stories around the news about domestic violence, raising awareness about this huge systemic issue that was occurring in China. Our second subpoint is going to be linking how the influence operations actually help solve for this. Because what's happening right now in the status quo is that these oppressive countries that are actually conducting these human rights abuses are spreading lots of disinformation in the media in those specific areas. Populations, for example, in Ukraine and Taiwan appeared more likely to vote for pro-Russian or China-endorsed candidates who have been historically shown to commit human rights abuses after repeated exposure to television channels by their respective leaders. One specific example is focused on Russia and Ukraine. A study of Americans exposed exposed to negative images of Ukraine by Russian media found that this exposure decreased approval and perceptions of Ukraine by 10%. This strategy, Russia implemented this strategy to replace Ukrainian media with pro-Kremlin press coverage and get people to support them. Second example we're going to be focusing on is Russia and Syria. Russian active measures first focused on creating an alternative narrative about the Syrian revolution to influence Western policies and sow confusion in Western societies about the situation that was happening over there. The expansive use of social media allowed Russia to weaponize its disinformation strategy, given the little fact-checking and the viral diffusion of striking news on social media accounts. A report published noted that the Kremlin attempted to achieve policy paralysis by sowing confusion, stoking fears, and eroding trust in Western and democratic institutions in those specific areas. To conduct these campaigns, Russia employs a synchronized mix of media that varies from attributed TV and news website content to far-right blogs and websites with unclear attribution, as well as unattributed social media accounts in the form of bots and trolls. Basically, the thing to gather here is that Russia is already spreading misinformation and in these different countries to the people of those countries and to Western societies. So they're spreading disinformation through online social media campaigns in these different countries and the United States, right? So they're spreading propaganda and false news about these different countries, about the issues that are occurring in those countries, and trying to cover up what they're doing, their imperialist actions, their actions in their human rights abuses in these different countries. And what the influence operations aimed to do was to spread awareness about how that's not true. The last example we're going to bring up is China. China is also spreading media washing. They have an ambitious project to media wash its role in the genocide of more than 10 million people in its far northwestern province. In a calculated attempt to divert attention away from the atrocities they've committed against the Uyghur people in northwest China, state-backed media outlets have intensified their efforts to disseminate pro-Chinese propaganda at home and abroad. The influence operation helped to go against this because China, again, they're trying to divert attention away from the human rights abuses that they're committing and have people think that they're not really doing that much, or like just make it seem like it's not as bad as it seems. But the influence operations helped to highlight the actual issue and spread the information about how, like, yes, China is committing these human rights abuses and they deserve to be condemned for it, and make sure that people aren't brainwashed into thinking that nothing is actually happening. What are the impacts of this? So our links are going to be that with the implementation of the influence operations, we were able to educate people on what these issues are in the world and make sure that their mindsets aren't supporting imperialistic and oppressive actors. Because if you support imperialistic and oppressive actors, then there's a higher likelihood that those imperialistic and oppressive actors are going to succeed in their goals and continue to decrease the quality of life of these people and also increase the amount of death and human rights abuse that they conduct. For those reasons and more, I urge a strong vote for the affirmation.
Cool. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, give me one second. Okay, brief off-time roadmap. I'm first going to start with the negative case and then move on to the affirmative. Is everyone ready? Cool. If everyone is good, we can start time now. We negate the resolution. Sure, we can agree with your framing that we should look towards global citizens, but let's start off with the definitions debate. Remember that a key thing that they leave out in their definitions is that a lot of this propaganda or the influence operation is conducted by AI. This is not humanly fact-checked, but rather they use AI in order to use these perpetuate these influence operations. This leads us into our first contention of misinformation. So point A is that our influence operations are constantly hijacked by other countries to spread information. This is because the information the United States puts out there sparks more controversy and allows rogue actors to use it as a jumping off point to spread information. Current information environments via the internet allows hostile actors to intervene and engage in our own influence operations. And foreign actors have been able to use this traction gained from US influence to spread their own misinfluence about things like genocides in China or the misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic and threatening public health. Look to the fact that all of these countries that they name, Iran, Russia, and China, and more specifically Iran, never had the foreign traction until United States influence operations went into the country or went and proliferated information, and then Iran retaliates. And because the United States sheds light on Iran, it gives Iran the spotlight to defend itself, and it also allows more people to support Iran. Subpoint B Subpoint B is that there's currently no authority or check on U.S. influence operations to verify whether the information we put out there is actually true. Look to what my opponents say in their last speech. It's really easy to put out information on social media. They talk about misinformation from China, Iran, and Russia, but look to the fact that the United States itself also engages in the spread of misinformation. Insofar as there is almost no fact checking that goes into this and almost no credibility, it's almost a spur of the moment decision to increase the spread of misinformation. Just recently, Russia used U.S. foreign operations as a justification to spread its own propaganda and misinformation, claiming that if the United States is attacking Russia, then they have the right to retaliate and respond. This gives more traction to countries that wouldn't have gotten the attention otherwise. Contention 2 is artificial intelligence. AI is often the control for marketing and social media. Subpoint A is fake news. AI can proliferate fake news, especially via influence operations, and can increase the tension between multiple groups and countries. This is very important in terms of the resolution, as AI is already using social media and marketing to spread ideas and convince people of fake news. Look to their own examples of China and Russia. We say that the United States is a catalyst for this movement because almost every movement from other countries has been reactionary and in reaction to United States influence operations. Subpoint B is privacy. We say even if the United States did want to go out there and conduct its own influence operations, it shouldn't be, the AI should not be the base of this influence operation. AI shouldn't be trusted with information campaigns, as privacy is violated and it can track multiple people and engage in its own human rights violations. Furthermore, this has already happened in the past, where in 2016, Trump Facebook marketing led to more political indoctrination and allowed for the United States government to indoctrinate people, which we say is much worse. Subpoint C is distrust. We say that this, when you have more and more influence operations, it leads to a slippery slope and causes people to distrust what the government puts out there in the first place, meaning less people are likely to trust the U.S. government. Now on to contention 3 of foreign adversaries. Influence operations allow other countries to intervene in our elections and lead to their own counter-influence operations. In 2016, Russia infiltrated our election via influence operations, and the main reason it does this was because it was threatened by our own influence operations. Again, it's retaliatory, and reactive, not proactive. We can't be hypocrites on the global stage and condemn their influence operations, and while we ourselves engage in our own influence operations. The only way we can get the entire international community to agree with us and prevent Russia, China, and Iran from being able to use their own influence operations is if we condemn it ourselves and stop acting and putting out more misinformation. Subpoint B is U.S. influence operations angered Russia, China, and Iran. As a result, online information operations linked to the Iranian regime the U.S. online information operations led to an increase in the Iranian regime blasting out to sway public opinion in Tehran and abroad. What we see is that after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, Iran has put out messages in reaction to United States influence operations to increase misinformation. And this wouldn't have gotten international traction if it wasn't for the United States who started it in the first place. Remember, the key argument here is that it's always reactionary. This leads us to contention 4 of United States soft power. United States influence operations are increasingly sophisticated, but the problem is that with this sophistication comes the ability for foreign countries to also use our technological advancements to propel their own agendas. Increased technological development spurs distrust and weakens relations amongst our own countries. We see that there's escalating distrust between the United States, Russia, and China because of influence operations particularly, and while it's decreasing trust, it also decreases our chances for diplomacy because we publicly condemn another country. This also eliminates all opportunity for us to have soft power talks, and that's crucial for the United States during the age of global interdependence. It's key to global cooperation and combating things like cyber terrorism and stopping human rights abuses. Think about it. No country is going to cooperate with the United States or succumb to our demands about stopping genocides if we start continually blast them on social media and other platforms and condemn what they're doing. Let's move on to the affirmative case. An overview to this case. Remember, the difference between a negative ballot and an affirmative ballot is that the negative ballot advocates for things like the New York Times or independent journalists to go out and spread the truth. The problem is that when we have the United States government get involved to spread influence operations, we risk war and escalation with other countries. This is why independent journalists will always do a much better job. That, coupled with the fact that independent journalists are fact-checked, means it's a lot easier for independent journalists like the New York Times to provide more accurate information. Let's move on to their first advantage of human rights abuses. They say that there's influence operations ran on 8 social media networks, and they talk about Ukraine and Russia. The problem here is that news outlets already covered everything that these influence operations have done. The second thing is that they talk about how influence operations have worked to inform the public, but there is zero impacting that they do here. They do not give you one tangible impact that has come out of people, like out of influence operations, and none of those impacts can be directly attributed to the fact that it was the United States government that pushed out this propaganda. More so, we say independent journalism has been capturing the news since it has started, especially with Russian imperialism, and that's what led more people to actually follow on to the news. But secondly, having the United States affiliated, we say, is an incredibly bad thing because it leads to increased tensions. But third, you should turn their subpoint B about Russia, because in response to our influence operation, Russia published its own influence operation, telling the world that it killed 48,000 terrorists, which actually led to the praise of Russia in Syria, which means that our influence operations did a lot worse than what the affirmative portrays. On subpoint B about China, they talk about the Uyghur genocide and the poor treatment in the country. There's 3 responses. 1, if anything, the Uyghur genocide has gotten worse since our influence operation. And in the meantime, since we've had that, the genocide has been accelerating, which means influence operations have done little to nothing. Secondly, all you do is embolden China, because previous to influence operations, China was at least coming to the negotiating table to talk to us about the treatment of Uyghurs. Now it's not going to say, it's going to try to save face and not even try to do anything. But third, influence operations by the United States are performative at best. What have we actually done to help the Uyghurs, if not just tell our own people that we have? Then on subpoint C of Ukraine and Taiwan and how they use a study. First, remember, it's parliamentary debate. You should disregard their study. But secondly, remember what they tell you themselves. There is less fact checking on social media. That's exactly our point. This increases political apathy and prevents people from actually buying that the United States is a credible actor, and which decreases trust. But secondly, remember, it shouldn't be government versus government. It should be journalists going out there and publishing the truth, because people trust that. But now, if the United States puts even one sort of idea of misinformation, it decreases trust in the United States government, and even the United States citizens are less likely to listen to our government. Even on their links, remember, a government is not necessary to fact check or spread information about what is going on in the world. We say the New York Times independent journalists are much better at doing this.
Okay, 1 second. Let me pull up my timer. In that moment, let me just give you guys an off-time roadmap. First, I will be addressing a bit of the definitions debate, and then I will be addressing the negations case, and then I will be addressing the affirmative case, our case, and finally I will get to the negations case, and if time permits, move on to some weighing. Okay, so my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Hi judges, hi opponents. My name is Divya Mohanty, and I'm the second affirmative speaker for this debate. Now let's start by addressing the literal definitions debate that is going on. My opponents talk about how influence operations are mainly carried out by AI, etc., and how we withheld that from our definition. We disagree with that. We will get to that more when we address their entire point on AI in their case. Okay. So now let's start with their attacks to our case. Okay, so they started by saying that we are risking the war and escalation with other countries, that in neg world, journalism will happen, but governmental interference will not. My opponents don't seem to understand that independent journalists also directly anger these countries. In fact, independent journalism, while it exists, also seriously endangers these independent journalists, especially when they might not be from our country. When they are from our country, this still puts them on some sort of a danger list, but especially independent journalism puts specific people in danger. Yeah, we're not saying independent journalism is a bad thing in any way, shape, or form. We still, of course, endorse journalism. But the fact is, oftentimes, first off, I will get to a point on this later about how the news is not as much valued in this day and age of social media. But also the fact is we're putting direct people in danger by simply only endorsing individual journalism, not allowing governments to back them in a way with influence operation. Now, they also say on the human rights abuses conducted by Russia, they say, oh, news outlets already covered. What my opponents do not understand is that in this day and age, 68% of people in a study conducted worldwide. My opponents might say disregard the study, but the fact is, in this tournament, we're only not supposed to cite, but our evidence, and as long as we link it to the point, should still be considered. 68% of people get their information, their daily information, off of social media and not platforms. Almost 2/3 of the world in this day and age gets their news off of social media and not these independent news sites. We're not spreading any sort of awareness. The impacts are nowhere close in magnitude if we're talking in independent journalism as opposed to social media, especially in this day and age. So the reason why this is relevant is because this brings all of their refutations down. The refutations just simply do not have the impact. If they bring up independent journalism, well, that, without being coupled with something that will actually reach people, is not an option. Nothing is happening with this independent journalism. Only 30% of the world is even looking at it. Okay, now let's move on to them saying that we have no tangible impacts, but we are literally telling you that this sort of influence operations from our country, from the United States, are being helpful. We are stopping disinformation. We are spreading awareness about all of these human rights abuses conducted, not only to the people in our country, but to the people in other countries as well. We are stopping propaganda from people who are being oppressive. Now, okay, so these are our impacts. The fact that these aren't any tangible impacts is so beyond incorrect. Influence operations can have measurable effects on people's belief and behaviors. Now, they say influence operations are performative at best. Turn my opponent's own refutations against this. They concede that foreign countries have previously conducted influence operations in the United States itself, showing that they do, in fact, make a difference. So their whole performative at best just simply cannot exist with the fact that they're like, oh, it's dangerous, because if it's only performative, there's no way it can be dangerous. My opponents try to tell you that propaganda makes a difference. If this type of misinformation influenced operations can make a difference, so can the fact checker US influence operations. Okay, they talk about how having the US affiliated with these countries is bad because of increased tensions. Well, right here, we would like to turn their own US soft power contention on them. If the US is shown to be condemning countries for committing human rights abuses, other countries will do the same. It is shown that they will do the same. The US sets precedent for many other countries to check back against powerful oppressive actors like Russia, China, stop them from continuing their abusive actions against specific groups of people. They say that disinformation increases political apathy and people don't buy that the US is here helping. Once again, we would like to turn this against their soft power point. People trust the United States. While we might not be the best country in any way, shape, or form, we are definitely an influence on the world stage. Our government is powerful enough to fact check information and ensure that they are spreading the correct information about human rights abuses. And they said that it shouldn't be government versus government. It should be journalist versus journalist, something along those lines. But the fact is, a journalist needs to be backed up by their country. A lot of these countries, like Russia, China, all of these countries are willing to to eliminate people who speak out against them. So when just one person publishes something in opposition to them, then they are in danger. Whereas if a whole government is backing them, this is just inherently a good thing, because this means that they aren't on their own or being put in as much danger. Now, let's start by addressing the next case. So the next case entirely falls apart on the fact that they are trying to paint the United States as the aggressor in these situations. The fact is, my opponents sorely misunderstand exactly from the United States and how these influence operations work in the United States. The only reason we started to use these in the first place was in response to Russian influenced operations about the annexation of Crimea and severe misinformation related to this. The US decided to set up their own systems, their own influence operation systems in response to this, because we were publicly condemning their horrific actions. The reason influence operations were set up in the first place were as a defense mechanism to stop against propaganda from an oppressive country. So my opponent's entire thing about being like, oh, all of these countries only put their own influence operations in place because the US did first is just so beyond incorrect that it should be completely disregarded. Okay, now let's continue on to their point on artificial intelligence, linking back to their definitions. Now, the fact is, artificial intelligence, though my opponents are painted as a bad thing, I have two responses to this. For one, the artificial intelligence in these influence operations is not as big of a hand as my opponents are painting it to be. It is not that big of a thing. It is mostly people who are employed by the US government to sorry, people employed by the US government who have the job to basically pose as these to basically pose as people and kind of people on these social media networks and promote the values and goals and correct fact proven thing anti-propaganda on these social media networks. And also the fact is, say you don't buy this, Judge, increasingly bettered artificial intelligence has been improved to recognize other foreign actors' artificial operations directly combating against them in response to their foreign adversaries' contention. It's a fundamental understanding these oppressive actors that have more than enough power themselves aren't going to be listening to us unless we prove that we are a power as well. Basically, in conclusion, the fact is that my opponents can either argue that these influence operations have no effect like they did in our AF case, or they can argue that they have some sort of effect like they do on their neg case. And the fact is, we have refuted both on both ends. So this is why we should. Sorry about going over time.
Then we'll go on the affirmative case and finally do some weighing. I'll start my timer on my first word. Our argument is simple. When you have influence operations, you give the microphone and spotlight to countries that would have been otherwise ignored, and that galvanizes support for them. For example, when we gave our example of Russia, when we called out Russia for Syria, Russia ended up getting more support than we did because they claimed it killed 48,000 terrorists in Syria. Starting off in the neg case, they say that okay, so they say that we can see the point that there are almost so they can see the point that there is almost no one fact checking us, right? There's nothing that's going to be fact checking the information because so much is being put out. So that means that now misinformation can also be sent from this side, right? So they have really no solvency whatsoever for misinformation because the United States is also capable of sending misinformation, especially because of AI, and even journalists may write misinformation. Okay, on to definition. They disagree with our definition of AI, but just makes no sense because I can give you historical Rich can give you historical precedent of when AI has been there for information for influence operations. Well, the example of this is the 2016 presidential election when Donald Trump's election presidency was bolstered by Facebook's influence operation, right? And it used specifically artificial intelligence. So clearly we're giving you like empirical evidence of when it has happened before. Okay, on to our first contention. They say that the thing about how like Russia retaliating is just beyond incorrect, but Judge, they have no real warrant for why it's bad, right? These nations are spreading misinformation because it's basically a back and forth of just telling about just like trying to give their perspectives of what's happening, right? It doesn't really do anything whatsoever. It's just creating this infinite loop where people are pointing fingers at each other. It's not going to actually solve back for the issue of misinformation unless we have journalists actually go in and solve these issues. Okay, on to artificial intelligence. They say it's not a big deal and it's mostly people who are doing this. But Judge, no, you can look to historical historical precedent. And in 2016, the presidential election, Trump's campaign was bolstered by AI, and it's too much information is being spread for journalists to do everything. There is no fact checking whatsoever for what is being said about AI. You can clearly extend this point because this is going to be one of the biggest things that you're voting off on the neg case. You cannot confirm anything that the opponent is saying because it can simply be lies. And also like there are multiple like war scenarios as well that could happen, right? So onto our third contention about like foreign adversaries. This contention remains mostly unresponded to. You can clearly extend the fact that like influence operations allow other countries to intervene in our elections, and how like Russia also did this in the 2016 election via hacking and other things like that, right? They infiltrate our country, and like we can't be hypocrites, right? We can't say that, oh well, this is only something we can do, but everyone else is exempt from this issue, right? So the U.S. So in fact, as a world power, as the opponent says, our duty is not to be hypocrites. So U.S. influence operations have already angered Russia, China, and Iran. For example, the Uyghur genocide, China isn't even willing to talk about it anymore because of what happened, right? So obviously, like if we actually want to solve back for the issues that the opponent is talking about, we need to be able to We have to be cooperative, and we can't just point fingers at other nations, right? Okay, unless like we actually have journalists who are unless we have journalists who are actually going to be able to who are like under names such as New York Times are doing the research, and we're going to be able to give the most accurate information possible. Okay, as a result, online information operations linked to the Iranian regime were blasting out messages to sway public opinion on like what's happening in Tehran and overboard, right? And this basically sways over international support. And so the fourth contention is U.S. soft power. You can cleanly extend that. We are not going to gain soft power if we are lying and being hypocrites. Okay, now into the AF case. They talk about how like independent journalists are still going to like directly so yeah, you can extend our thing about how like if you have influence operations, you're giving a microphone and spotlight to countries that would have otherwise been ignored, and then you galvanize support for them. So we gave you the example of like Russia, when Russia ended up killing more ended up getting more support than it did like getting hate, when like when campaigns like basically made Russia seem like it had killed 48,000 terrorists in Syria. Okay, now onto the first point about onto the first advantage. They tell you that independent journalists like directly anger these countries, but judge, it's still not a justification for war, and it's harder to attribute it to just one country, right? Because when journalists are telling you about what's happening, you cannot just pinpoint every like journalist into one bag. Okay, then they talk about how like putting people in danger by that you're putting people into danger by endorsing journalists, right? Okay, judge. Independent journalists already have a dangerous job, so it's already non-unique. But they concede the fact that journalists are capable of fact checking. So now we're going to be knowing the actual truth of what is happening, rather than a lie that is being made by AI and which is full to the brim with biases. Okay, then they talk about how like 68% of people get information and news off social media. Okay, sure, but news outlets literally have social media accounts, so this doesn't even work here, because most people even get their news from social media. For example, you may get your news from MSNBC, but the Twitter account of MSNBC, NBC, right? Or like the Instagram account of like New York Times or The Economist. So we don't need the U.S. government to post about it, right? They talk about how independent journalism is far worse, but once again, Judge, you can cleanly extend the fact that independent journalism is fact check. This remains conceded, and you can cleanly extend it throughout the case. Okay, they say that this brings on all of our arguments down, but it really doesn't, because we're telling you how it's the best possible solution. Okay, so they talk about how like independent journalists are going to anger these countries, but judge, okay, look, independent journalists are already are cannot all just be placed into one category. Okay, then they talk about how like the influence operation is being helpful and is spreading awareness, but judge, how is it influential operation solving for Uyghur genocides, right? It's not actually, it doesn't have any solvency whatsoever. Overview of their arguments is none of the arguments isolate casualty. There's no way to attribute any success to influential operates. You cannot measure whether these have worked or they haven't. But what they concede is the conditions for the Uyghur Muslim in China got worse after the U.S. influence, because once China saw the United States basically putting out campaigns, this made them get even more upset, and therefore they made conditions even worse. So they're not solving for anything. You can turn their arguments about solving for the genocide because they do nothing except make it worse. In response to our influence operation, Russia published its own operation and told the world that it killed 48,000 terrorists, which led people to believing Russia, and therefore they proliferate Russia misinformation and even belief in Russia, right? Okay, then they say that you can turn the argument about how like everything they're doing is performative at best, because like we can see that like Russia and stuff have done the same thing. Judge, we are talking about solving genocide in this debate and fact checking information. All they tell you is, well, you know, these AI these people might be okay. So first of all, you have no way to actually fact check anything they say, and second of all, even if you inform people, how is it directly going to solve the Uyghur genocide? Because all it's doing in the status quo right now is convincing China to just treat them even worse because they're getting even more upset, right? We're talking about solving genocide, not they misunderstand our arguments. Uh, so U.S. soft power. So like we also are increasing soft power. So now the United States can actually be trusted. But doing this is going to and is going to be able to get like these ideas on the negotiating table, right? It's going to be able to actually talk to these nations about these problems, because what's happening right now is that these nations already have this hate towards the United States because they're spreading campaigns against them, right? So there's already a lot of conflict. Okay, you can cleanly extend our point about how like Russia uses strategy to show pro-Kremlin press coverage, because this is unresponded to. And judge, because we are the only side that is clearly advocating to mitigate genocides, to fight back against disinformation campaigns, and to also stop all the impacts of basically increasing Russian trust, I urge you to vote for the negative. Opposition.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Brief off-time roadmap. I'm just gonna go into three like voting issues in this round, and it'll start off with the negative case and then move on to the affirmative. Is everyone good? Perfect. There are three key reasons you can cleanly vote in opposition in this round. The first is going to be our argument that goes cold conceited about galvanizing support for other countries. What happens is that most countries do not get the press coverage they need in order to get support for their actions. For example, most people condemned Russia's invasion of Syria, but what happens when the United States government issues like influence operations is that you give these countries a spotlight and you galvanize support for them. They concede our example in which their own example in which when Russia talked about when the United States covered the government had an influence operation about Russia and Syria, it ended up allowing Russia to get the spotlight where Russia talked about how it killed 48,000 terrorists, which ended up giving more support to Russia than it would have otherwise. This proves to you that influence operations only embolden and also give a spotlight to countries that wouldn't have otherwise gotten the support that they need. This turns the entirety of the affirmative because all of their arguments are about how multiple different countries we can stop for their human rights violations. But what you're actually doing is increasing the chance that these countries can justify themselves and justify their atrocities. The second reason you can vote opposition is going to be misinformation and fact checking. Our argument is simple. We say independent journalists are much better. They cold concede our argument about how about how current influence operations in the United States influence operations have little to no fact checking. This means that it's almost a clear vote for the opposition because it has a multitude of impacts. First, we tell you independent journalists are much better at fact checking because they have to fact check in order for them to create and retain any credibility. But secondly, they try to tell you that independent journalism also angers these countries, but no, they don't, because they're independent. They're not affiliated with a country. That's exactly our argument. Even if they can anger the country doesn't have a justification to wage war against countries like the United States, because when the government issues a press or an influence operation versus an independent journalist from the New York Times, there's a much different response. But this is also really important because it extends to all of our arguments about increased chances of escalation and war. Remember, when a country issues a direct influence operation that criticizes other countries, you decrease the chance that other countries are even going to get on the negotiating table. But because of fact checking and because of independent journalists, you allow this to happen. But there's a second impact to fact checking that goes cold conceded. It's the fact that no one is going to trust the United States government when they issue future influence operations or future press releases about what's going on in our world, because they don't fact check when they send out information. This is an argument that goes conceded time and time again. This is going to be very important because if no one trusts the United States government, then all of their impacts fall through. At the end of the day, it's much better for independent journalists to go into these countries or to go and report on what's going on because most people get their information from there. They try to tell you that most people get their information off of social media and not like websites like the New York Times. But remember, the New York Times, Fox News, multiple other New York Times or like MSNBC all have social media accounts, which is what most people get used to get their news. Other than extremely far right or far left supporters who only follow Twitter or social media accounts of like very far right or far left candidates, most people get their information, yes, from social media. But remember that all of these different organizations like New York Times are on social media, which is where people get their information from, which means there is zero response made to this contention, which means you can cleanly extend this. These two have two implications. First, it means not only does the affirmative make their own impacts worse because they galvanize support and embolden other countries, but secondly, they don't have any fact checking, which means no one trusts the United States in the future. But the third main reason you can vote opposition is going to be our soft power argument. Remember, our argument is very simple. The United States will never be able to get other countries on the negotiating table if we keep talking about them on social media. Instead of outwardly criticizing them on social media, it is much more likely that we can get them on the negotiating table if we don't talk about them on social media. Look to the China and Uyghur genocide. China was on the negotiating table before US influence operations, and now afterwards, China is literally not willing to negotiate whatsoever. At the end of the day, we urge you to ask yourselves, has there been any impact from US influence operations? They concede that the Uyghur genocide got worse. They concede that Russia was able to use these influence operations to further their own agenda, and they concede that Iran also used these to send out their own influence operations. They have done nothing, and if not, make the impacts worse.
Okay, so before I begin my speech, I'm just going to be covering some voters and then non-voters and then weighing. Good? Okay, this will be a 5-minute speech, and my time will begin on my first word. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. We strongly affirm the resolution that this House regrets the removal of the influence operations. There are going to be multiple reasons why you're going to be voting for affirmatives. What this debate boils down to is whether conflict between foreign powers as a result of influence operations is a good thing or not, and my opponents make many fundamental mistakes in addressing this. First of all, they turn themselves multiple times in their case. One thing that they bring up is how there's no way to fact check for the US government, but then they say like, oh, journalists can fact check because they have to prove that they're credible. To this we have two responses. One, they say that independent journalists have to fact check because they have to remain credible. This fundamentally doesn't make sense for the response to the U.S. government. Cross-apply their own reputation. The U.S. government is more likely to fact-check their own information to remain credible because they're a large nation. They want to remain credible. The U.S. knows that they're a large power and they want to remain trustworthy to their own people. If they want to remain credible, then they're going to fact-check their own sources.
Order, you can pause time.
I'm responding to, I'm bringing this refutation up right now because the argument that journalists have to fact check to remain credible was something brought up in the second speech.
No, it was brought up in the first negative constructive, but it's up to the judges. We say it's a new argument about like the United States government fact checking, but it's up to the judges.
Okay, I'm at 50 seconds. I'll continue. Second, they say that we cold concede that the U.S. government is not going to be trusted. False. We clearly tell you that people will trust the government because the U.S. government will fact check. My partner clearly said that the U.S. government is a large nationwide entity. They're going to fact check their sources. They're more trustworthy than some journalists who might have their own implicit bias about specific topics. The second reason they turn themselves is they talk about U.S. soft power, and then they say that we're not going to be able to fact check. One, we have soft power. We know that the United States is powerful. They're clearly going to fact check their own sources. The second reason why we're going to be winning is on their point on galvanizing support for other countries, which is, again, what this debate boils down to. Is the conflict created by these influence operations a good thing or not? They say we cold concede this point, but we don't. Extend my partner's refute, which should tell you how they sorely misunderstand how exactly these influence operations have worked in the United States. The only reason we started to use these influence operations back in like 2013 and 2014 was in response to Russian influence operations first. After Russia's annexation of Crimea and severe misinformation related to this specific event, the United States decided to set up their own responses because we were publicly condemning their horrific action. The U.S. doesn't start these operations, start these conflicts. It's other oppressive powers that begin conflict in the U.S. That tries to ensure that people in those specific regions have adequate information on the news and media about this. Countries like China and Russia, my opponents try to tell you that with U.S. soft power, they're going. Other countries are going to be listening to the United States and coming to the negotiating table. But judge, that's not going to happen. Extend my partner's refute, where she tells you that these countries aren't going to negotiate because they're oppressive powers with enough power themselves to not succumb to the United States. If the United States does nothing in response to these countries spreading misinformation, and just lets this misinformation continue to spread, then what's going to happen is that this misinformation is what people are going to believe. And when people believe, say like when China tells them that they're not doing anything to the Uyghur Muslims, then the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims and things like Russia's horrible treatment of Crimea or like Russia's imperialism in the Middle East is going to be proliferated because again, these countries are not going to be willing to come onto the negotiating table. This conflict that's created by these influence operations is actually a good thing because it ensures that these oppressive powers aren't the only one that gain tyrannical majority in these in social media, right? Okay. Another reason you're going to be voting for, the biggest reason you're going to be voting for us is check back and awareness. Human rights abuses are a huge thing that are occurring in the world right now. Oppressive actors like Russia and China, again, are not going to care about whether the United States says or United States doesn't say anything. They're not going to come to the negotiating table because if they succeed in their influence operations, people aren't going to believe that they're doing anything wrong. And if people aren't going to believe that they're doing anything wrong, then these operations can continue smoothly. And then these people are still dying. Human rights abuses are still continuing. At least if there's some conflict in the media, people are able to see different views on the specific topic, and we can have both sides, like the United States point of view and these oppressive powers point of view in the media. If only the oppressive powers point of view is in the media, then that's what people are going to believe. And if people believe that, then those human rights abuses and that death is proliferated. My opponents try to say that we have no tangible impact, but we clearly do, because again, if these oppressive powers are allowed to dominate social media, if there's no United States in the picture, if these oppressive powers no longer have to fear the United States countering them with influence operations, then they're going to dominate social media. They're going to spread misinformation. And when they do that, they're not going to come to the negotiating table. Why? Because they're succeeding in conducting their human rights abuses. And when they succeed, there's no reason for them to negotiate some sort of deals. Okay. Moving on to they tell you how we have no solvency on oh wait, no, the solvency for these influence operations is going to be awareness. The magnitude is that this conflict actually helps. This conflict provides alternative viewpoints in the media. This conflict ensures that these oppressive powers don't have don't have majority in social media. It ensures that these oppressive powers aren't able to succeed in their misinformation in the media. For the vote for the team that's going to increase this awareness to the people in these countries where misinformation is spread. Vote for the people that is fighting against human rights abuses. Vote for the team that is calling these oppressive powers out on what they're doing wrong. Vote affirmative.
Great debate.
Good debate.
Good debate.
Yeah, great job. Cool. Okay, so the decision was a 2-1 for op. The one dissenting vote was Steve. So Steve wants to give his RFD first, and then us two who voted on op can give it afterwards.
Yeah, let me start my video. Yeah, I think I based my decision based on the value proposition. The value proposition at the very beginning was the value for the people across the world, not just here in the US. I didn't think there was a clear decision on my part, whether or not the government versus independent journalists was fact-checking or more factual. I did not lean that government information would be propaganda, but kind of lean to the fact that both journalists and the government could be equally unbiased, and also felt that the people who are oppressed, they actually do need a voice, and getting that information out to the world was a positive thing. So I actually voted for the affirmative. There we go.
Sounds good. Yeah, I can give my RFD first for the opposition. I voted for the opposition. I think the burden in this round or one of the big burdens that in the round that the Gov needed to cover was to show that there's like an advantage of social media that's unique over independent journalists, especially when op provides independent journalists as a like alternative mechanism. And I think Gov tries to do it in two separate ways. First with like fact checking. I think that Gov kind of goes on the defensive and tries to show that the government can still be very factual, whereas like op is trying to show that the government is just not very factual at all. I think for the most part, op succeeds in casting doubt into the factuality of the government, mostly with the AI mechanism, and strengthened by mechanization under how large the amount of media that the government needs to put out for that also is kind of talked about on the affirmation about just like how much information needs to be spread. I think then it's a little bit ineffective when the government tries to say that, you're still going to have a lot of fact checking because the USG wants to maintain its soft power, because it's not a very good mechanization against the op mechanization there. I think the second way in which government tries to show that there's an advantage for social media is that by saying that a lot of people get their news from social media, but I think op's refutation that there are a lot of accounts from media sources that are from independent journalists on these social media platforms is a good enough refutation to kind of take off that offense for Gov. I think what I'm left with on Gov is this entire point about a check back against, authoritarian regimes and against people committing human rights abuses, which is ultimately what comes into the weighing in this round. But I think on op, I get points about against this, because when op is basically saying that authoritarian regimes and all those are using the US action first as justification, I think that specifically hones in on the media, whereas the government refutation against this is that the US is responding to something that happened outside of the media, which is why I don't think the government refutation that the US isn't the first strike here really works. I think antagonization generally goes to op, I question in reality like how much authoritarian regimes are going to negotiate in the first place, which I think, government kind of points out. Um, but like I do think in this debate it does lean a little bit towards op there. And I think that trust in the US government stays on the board for op. So when I'm weighing, I ultimately get like this retaliation point and the trust point versus the check back point, of which I think op ends up outweighing just because, you don't have a lot of solvency on the gov from what I'm seeing.
Cool. Yeah, I can give my RFD next. So yeah, I end up voting negative in this round, and here's why. One of the things that makes this round slightly difficult for me to evaluate by the end of the PMR is the fact that neither the PMR or LOR is really reading any impact weighing or framing. I do think that the LOR is doing a good job of outlining the technical interaction between the offense that the block is collapsing to in the 1AC, which ends up substantially contributing towards why the block is ahead by the end of the debate, but there is no impact framing that is read on this offense as to why it outweighs the offense the PMR ends up collapsing to. Likewise, the PMR is not justifying or framing the offense that they are collapsing to under any internal impact weighing either. That makes it slightly difficult for me to evaluate the debate on the flow, i.e. without judge intervention, as I'm left with no mechanism that either team is justifying for my ballot to evaluate the round, and thus the offense to prioritize within it, which if the round would have shaped out a little differently, would have made it a little bit difficult for me to evaluate. Luckily though, in the context of this round and working through the line by line of the debate, that doesn't become relevant to resolving the ballot and thus voting negative. So at this point in my evaluation of the round, I move to working through the line by line and start with working through what offense the block is resolving link uniqueness to, i.e. winning by the end of the PMR. I start here because the LOR tells me that the block collapse to misinformation as well as the soft power offense internally linked turns all of the 1AC offense, meaning if the block does end up resolving link uniqueness to this offense, it would implicate the 1AC as not being able to solve for any of its offense and in fact causing its own offense. I start on the misinformation offense and thus the contention one of the LOC and think that the block is pretty far ahead on this layer of the debate. The only response to this offense I get in the PMR is the extension of this MG argument, which says that US imperialist propaganda on social media only began in response to Russian junior imperialism's annexation of Crimea. The problem with this argument is that even if I am to grant the PMR 100% strength of link to this offense, which I likely would, as I don't think the block is really spending much time on this root cause portion of the debate, likely because it's not that relevant strategically, it does not deny the substance of the offense that the block is going for, i.e. there's an extension of the A sub point by the block under this contention one that says that US imperialist propaganda operations produce contradictions that enable other nations to defend themselves as well as get global and public spotlight, or as the LOC and block puts it, engage in retaliatory actions. This defense that is extended by the PMR does not seem to answer this substance, or at least it's not explained as to how it does in the context of the round, as the fact of how it started does not seem to implicate the fact that it does function in this way, given that that is conceded by the PMR. Even if I am to grant the PMR access to this defense, though, I would likely just evaluate that the block is ahead and resolves this defense on strength of link, as the block is extending this warrant about how Russian monopoly capitalism meddled with US bourgeois elections as a direct response of US imperialist propaganda operations in Russia, which empirically justifies the above claim of the negative, while the MG and PMR have no warrant to justify their defense. Regardless of that link layer of the contention of this offense as well, the block is extending this warrant and this analysis about how US imperialist propaganda operations rely on AI, and these AI spread misinformation. That's conceded by the MG and PMR, so generates a clear link to this offense regardless. Thus, a result of the block is winning pretty clearly link uniqueness to this misinformation offense. This is relevant because the LOR reads this internal link framing about how if the 1AC's defense of US imperialist propaganda operations on social media spreads misinformation either from the US or otherwise, then that means that it turns all of the 1AC offense. It does because it means that the 1AC enables other nations to justify their counter-revolutionary violence, thus generating support for the continuation of such, and creates distrust amongst the world with the US government, meaning that even if the imperialist propaganda operations that the 1AC describes are good in some twisted way, they have no solvency because nobody will read or believe them. I think this is enough for me to vote negative because it non-uniques all of the 1AC offense the PMR collapsed to, and it means that the only offense, it means that all of their offense are net benefits to voting negative, since the block is also winning this argument about how independent journalists solve better, this sort of like pseudo counterplan without a counterplan argument, and thus means that the block's misinformation offense is the only external offense left within the debate, which means I would vote negative. I think that I could also vote negative elsewhere on the flow though, and I did work through the rest of the round, so if y'all are curious as to how I evaluate some of the other arguments, you can definitely let me know and I can go through those. I will just say to both teams that perhaps be a little bit careful in some of the arguments that you're reading, as there's just like a lot of just like explicit US imperialist propaganda that's thrown around in this debate. I mean, the 1AC gets up and start talking about how Russia and China are imperialists, which is true, but like so is the US, and the US doesn't really care about the oppressed masses globally. It just cares about opportunistically claiming that in order to, accumulate more capital, etc. I think there's just like a lot of arguments that perhaps we could be a little bit more nuanced and engaging within instead of just, kind of replicating word for word. And that makes it a little difficult for me to resolve this round. But that's sort of external to my evaluation of the round, since, both teams are basically just two sides of that coin in terms of the arguments they are reading. But yeah, if you all have any questions, you can definitely let me know.
I think we're good. Thank you, Alice, for judging. Good round.
Thank
Good
you.
debate.
Good round. Good luck.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.